concerns or opinions about, you know, where we would like to go with this regional transit dialogue phase 2, outside of the commuter corridors study, and we will staff that and help, you know, and you know, if we have to set up subcommittees to do that, we'd be happy to do all that kind of good stuff as well. But I'd just like to open it up and hear your thoughts.
Anybody want to get started?
Well, I think if the individual communities can start actually setting aside land and doing zoning, Doug and I were talking a couple of days ago about the fact that Edmond actually has already, we're doing an RFP for a new downtown master plan for reuse, but in that is contemplated that an area of town that there will be a station. So it's actually going to show up on our plan. It does now, but it'll show up more effectively in our master plan to be the light rail train station. So we're making the plans hopefully long way ahead of time, so that we'll have the land use available for that when the time comes.
Well, is your existing station usable, or will you have to?
Oh, we'll probably have to. The one around Fourth and the railroad. Yeah, I think there's some aspects of that. It's an old Red Rock building that I think it does have some historical reuse, don't you think, Tim?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And but the land use is being preserved, and then that caused another issue when we needed to build our new public safety center, that because we had decided that we were going to reserve that land for the rail station, it took away land that we could have used for an outside facility. But I'm pleased to say that decision had already been made to reserve that land for the train station, and that's much more forward-looking, I think, than to have just grabbed it and done some other use out of it.
Well, let me ask. We talk sometimes about the line going to Midwest City and Tinker. What is Midwest City's options about a station? Is there anything there, or?
Actually, we've already been looking at some of the old rail that run through some of the old lumber yards. When Mr. Atkinson really started Midwest City, that had been abandoned. We're looking at, actually, we've been talking with Joe Atkinson already about acquiring some of that, looking to the future.
Where is that exactly? Can you give me a street address?
15th and Midwest Boulevard, just to the north. If you're familiar with it, we have rail that runs right through there, and then a half a mile to the east of it, it turns south and goes to Tinker. Okay. And so we're trying to acquire enough to make sure there's also adequate parking besides the station.
Okay, good to know.
Well, and also, I'm glad the mayor mentioned that where Doug South goes to Tinker. We've had some preliminary discussions with Tinker Air Force Base when we did an original Tiger grant a couple of 3 years back, about the possibility of doing some kind of public-private station at Tinker Air Force Base, some with secured access for personnel and then the public side as well. So, you know, those discussions are taking place.
Good.
We'll raise them again.
Yeah, Cindy?
Yeah, I would just mention that the timing of this is certainly coincides with some significant things we're trying to do in Norman. We have a proposal for a comprehensive transportation plan on our agenda. Sooner we can get it done, but it is intended to look at both our place in the region, but also internally in terms of the city, and look at all modes of transportation. So that will drive then some land use decisions when we update our 2025 plan, which will come probably next year. There's also a discussion going on in our community about high density. It certainly relates to this issue in terms of generating, locating higher density developments near transit options. So both of those things make this very timely for us.
Are there other rail lines north-south other than the one Santa Fe line that goes, down to through Main Street? There's nothing west of I-35.
No.
Okay. Well, let me say a few things, and a lot of this is generalities, but I think it helps for us to have a big picture perspective and to see where we agree and where we might disagree, and try to figure out how we can all get to the point where we're all pulling in the same rope at the end of the day. I think where we would agree is that the people of this region are underserved when it comes to public transit. No matter how you define public transit, we all hear the complaints, and most of them are accurate. You know, we underserve our populace. A lot of it is because of sprawl. There's a lot of, you know, very common sense responses to why we don't have the density and to why we can't make public transit work efficiently as we'd like. We also don't have a whole lot of traffic congestion in the metro area, at least compared to other metro areas. So there's a couple of things that, you know, are kind of the reasons for why we got here. But when you start to break down, you know, how you resolve those public transit issues, you start to see different priorities. If Oklahoma City looked at itself in a vacuum and said, what do we need to improve public transit in Oklahoma City, it would be a better bus system. Our bus system is just horrible. It doesn't do a good job in the inner city or the outer city, or it doesn't do a good job in how the frequency in any manner. And that's because we underfund it, not certainly because of the people that are in charge of it. And secondly, you know, we'd like to, you know, to go beyond the streetcar system and get more of a rail-based system in there. But there's no question that the bus system would be, you know, the priority for Oklahoma City as a whole. I suspect there are other communities that would suggest that, yeah, they'd like a better bus system too, but they really need rail. Commuter rail is probably the priority. And not only are those kind of conflicting priorities, but when you look at the financing of them, the conflict grows even larger. Because when you're talking about a bus system, the capital costs are probably affordable, the operation costs are not. And when you're talking about commuter rail, the capital costs are not affordable, and the operational costs are. And so you start to see how, you know, if we're all going to work together here, how complicated, how much give and take is going to have to take place. We looked a little bit at Doug's history on the elected versus appointed. And as I recall, you know, we looked at creating the 9 districts. And one of the reasons we didn't want to have them elected was just because there are so many elected officials in this region already. It just seemed irresponsible for us to collect one more round of elected officials. We need to be going the other way. We need fewer elected officials. And so that, you know, that was kind of the lay of the land that kind of, you know, led, I guess, me and others to, you know, we probably ought to have appointed. Well, you know, we don't really want the state, you know, appointing them. Well, that really makes it rely on the municipalities. And in most municipalities in this region, it's a mayor appointing and their council approving. That's just kind of in a general basis. Well, then you get into these 9 districts which aren't drawn according to municipal boundaries. And so how in the world do you start deciding which mayor and council get to start appointing? That's probably where the conflict comes in. And, you know, no sense arguing about it today because it'll have to be argued at some point in the future. Nobody's getting an early start on that. But I think those are the types of issues that are going to interject themselves and start to play out politically. We talked about the fact that sales tax seemed to be our community's easiest get. If you're wanting to change something and it requires a change in funding or new funding, generally we've had more success with sales tax. I really think we would need some polling to assume that that's true going forward. And it could be that we've reached a ceiling on sales tax. I think in most of our cities, all of them that I know of, we're as high as we've ever been. I don't think anybody has a sales tax today that's lower than it was 10 years ago. And so it's irresponsible to assume that sales tax could just continue to go up without any voter pushback. So that's another consideration. And, you know, in other communities, they've been successful in getting the voters to put themselves in a gas tax or some other taxation form. And maybe it's a combination, but when you start doing the combinations, you just gather more opponents at the polls in a campaign. So there aren't any easy way outs on those funding formulas, but we know in a populous state like this, we're going to have a vote. And we know that if we don't have any polling, you can't really determine without it what your best effort's going to be and what your best strategy's going to be. Talked a little bit about the state. One thing we can do is continue to advance the conversation at the state level. I think each of us in our respective state legislators and state senators needs to start talking about public transit with them more and more. I think advancing the conversation is very valuable on that distant day, a few years from now, when we'll actually be asking them to help us. But if it's a surprise to them then, the conversation will just be starting again. We need to start the conversation with them now about how they need to get more involved in public transit. And finally, and I hate to end up with a little more sobering thought, but a lot of the discussion today takes place along a conversation where you might have to deal with the railroads. And the railroads are not easy to deal with. And so that's one of the things that traditionally drives up the cost, it seems to me, because we all start talking about wanting to have dedicated lines, so you're less reliant on the railroads, and that just drives up the cost quite a bit. And so it's just one more thing to keep in mind. It's just because you see a railway track that goes north and south doesn't mean you're going to get access to it very easily. And that's just one more sobering thought when we go forward. And with that, let me kind of stop and let others interject and pile on or correct. Yes, Steve.
The only thing that makes working with the railroads worse is if it goes through Corps of Engineer land. So to clarify, it's one notch worse. One of the things that I am very encouraged about what we're talking about here is that people 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago made these kinds of hard decisions and made these kinds of hard recommendations about water supply. They did it about municipal water supplies. They did them about the kinds of amenities that in their day people thought, really, are you crazy? We need to acquire water. We got to build a lake for what reason? We don't need it today. And so part of our responsibility is helping people get that sense of noblesse, that people are doing something great for the future as well as for themselves, because most people won't be able to experience the full ramifications of this 25 years from now, when we hope that Oklahoma City is one of the most robust metro areas in the nation, and we do need to make sure that people can get back and forth and that commerce can thrive. And so I think we have a great opportunity to couch this whole effort as the kind of thing that really wise people do, that diplomats and statesmen have done before, and we have a chance to do it again.
Thanks.
Well, if I can piggyback onto that, when we're talking about objectives near term and term, and Mr. Mayor, when you were just a moment ago talking about state conversation, discussion with state legislators, it strikes me that one of the objectives ought to be on a continuous basis is public education, and which then goes to the need, and you could address it as an obligation, but if we're going to meet our needs going forward. But it seems to me the opportunity to paint a different vision of what the community can look like. If it's a huge impediment 25 years from now, resolving that or addressing it is also a huge opportunity for a different sort of community and economic community development over that same 20-25-year period. The challenge is going to seem to me with the legislature, the state, with the community generally, is selling them on that picture in a progressive fashion, and not waiting for a sales tax or a certain tax to do it, but building support along the way. So I don't know if that falls to this group, but if we hope to put together such a plan and sell it, doing that cold is more of a challenge. So.
A couple of things that I thought about that I think might be good, and Doug, and things we could look at beyond what we did in RTD 1 on our subcommittees, technical aims, everybody did a lot of work. But I think economic development could be something that we could have a group focus on, about what transit does from those lines. And I think most everybody's aware of transit-oriented development, which goes a long way to addressing the issues about density that everybody's talking about. And I think having some kind of look at that along the way of what it brings, both not just to the suburbs on the commuter system, but also to the core, because that's a big part of selling these systems, whether it's to the public or to the people that are going to ride them and support them, and the businesses. And I don't think we really looked at that in great detail. I don't recall in the first one. And then the other thing too, it might be good to, I've tried to put some hypothetical timelines together, and I've sent some of those around, but you know, you really do have to start in the future and work back and try to figure out, okay, do we want to envision the system, say, beginning operation in a decade? Okay, if that was a reasonable goal, a decade, well then work backwards and what do you have to do to the points along the way to be prepared to have that in operation? You know, when would you have to have an RTA in place? When would you have to have the funding sources ready? I just think that's a good discussion that we could look at too, just some hypothetical timelines, and I know you've looked at that too.
You know, this is never, the transit's never an easy discussion. If you need it today, we're too late in the process because it just doesn't happen quickly. Roy Williams was quoted recently as saying you build transit for the city you want to have, not the one you have today, which is a good comment, a good quote, because it always is about the future. So we have to look past whether it's going to make full economic sense today. We have to look, is it going to make economic sense in 15 years, in 20 years, in 25 years, in 35 years. I also agree that throwing the railroads under the bus, we all should get on board that train. But there's also some issues where the railroads might be helpful. You know, I know the Burlington North Santa Fe wants to double track all the way from Mexico to the north. So somewhere in that process, in what we're trying to do, maybe we can get some help from them in going through this process. I don't know it's going to be helpful. It makes a big difference, but I don't think we ought to just discount it totally. And as far as how we put it together, looking at 3 quarters at once, while it might make sense to do 1 quarter at a time, I think we almost need all 3 to justify the ridership issues. I don't think we can do it. Doug Edmonds can do it by himself, neither can Norman, neither can Midwest City, because if you want to have a project that makes any sense, you've got to show enough ridership in the initial phases to justify what you're trying to do. So I don't think you can separate them. You obviously can't do them all at once as far as the infrastructure and the construction, but they all need to be part of the overall process. Just like MAPS had lots of projects, but you take them one at a time as you go through the construction phase. So.
Mayor, I really like the sales tax because people are used to that. It's a pay-as-you-go. They see something built, they like it. And you can do the same thing with the rail lines that's been done with MAPS. And, you know, about the time the sales tax is going to expire, they say, well, let's do something else because you can see that it's working. And whether you put in, you know, like a segment or 2 segments of the rail, and you see it's operating properly, you put it where there's lots of ridership, or you think there's going to be lots of ridership. I just think that's the way to go because bond issues, you know, people don't want debt for 20 years anymore. And selling bonds anymore is a real issue, just trying to get them sold. So I like the thought of the sales tax.
I think that as a part of the education piece, we have to give the public a vision of what this can be. Anybody who travels to a higher density city knows what you can get from that. But a lot of people haven't traveled, and these are voters. So we have to give them a vision beyond what they assume public transportation is. And I think that has to start early in the process. And not just an oral vision, but we have to give them things that they can see and visualize. I think that's going to be a big part in getting the support we need from the public.
I have a little different view on the sales tax part of it. Municipalities are so dependent on sales tax, I think we need to take a long, hard look whether we're willing to forever commit another penny to something. I think that when we rise and fall based on sales taxes, the idea that they're more stable than the other tax, I'd like to see his statistics on that because I'm not sure that's true. You look across the country, their sales taxes have been the death knell when they fell for some cities right here in Oklahoma City when we've gone through this. So I'm a little skeptical that sales tax is the very, certainly it's not, I just don't think it could be the leader. I think a gasoline tax is a better way to go. I know that would be more difficult, and I understand what he said about the more ways you do it, the more enemies you, I understand that completely. But the gasoline tax is like the sin tax on health. I mean, there's a nexus between the tax and what we're trying to do, and I think that's reasonable. The other, there's a lot, certainly the devil is in the details on this. When you look at the things that you raised, Mick, about how we would do the appointment part. But I think those are things we can be doing now. I think that's the kind of thing we need to be seriously taking a look at. I mean, those are decisions that are gonna have to be made collectively. We're all gonna have to decide how to do it. I think we can start to move on that. I also think that we need to be more aggressive about rail lines that are available. There's some rail lines now that could be obtained still. They're still hanging out there, and I think collectively we ought to go after those corridors that are still available. UP's got one that would hook the Midwest City thing up, and I think we ought to be much more aggressively pursuing that. The other thing is, I noticed in that district map, this is a personal comment, but the ward that I represent is not totally in the district. Some of it's outside the district. And I'm wondering, if you do that, how you're ever going to figure out, are you going to have if you use the sales tax, for instance, if you're on one side of the street, are you going to have to pay it, and on the other side of the street you're not? I mean, those are things we need to, you think about the devil in the details, those are the kind of things that we have to come to grips with those things really before we can move forward. I do appreciate your analogy to the water system, because I don't think of when I think about what's going on in central Oklahoma, and I look at the most forward-thinking things that happened in the last 60 years, it's the fact that we protected the water system and therefore provided the gasoline, if you will, to keep the economic engine of Oklahoma City running. And I don't mean just Oklahoma City, all of central Oklahoma, because our system is a much larger system than just Oklahoma City's now, and we're trying to make it even larger than that. But I think that's a perfect analogy to the kind of forward thinking we're going to have, because as kind of a student of history, part of that's from being really old. You become a student of history just because you lived through most of it. All the councilmen that were eligible to be re-elected were defeated in the next election after they voted to build the Atoka pipeline. So I think that shows what a tough chore it is to be that forward thinking, and but I think that's what we're going to have to do to build a regional transportation system that matters. So, but I do think starting in on the details, Doug, is something we need to start thinking about, because we don't want to get down the road and then have one of these detail problems blow up on us and find out we've got to stop and worry about whether they're going to be elected or appointed or how we're going to do it right in the middle of something else. I just think moving on it is vital, because I think the longer you wait, the more it costs, the more problems you're going to run into. I know you don't want to do it. We don't want to do it without a proper background, but I think over the long run, the cost of it is just going to eat us up if we don't really start to get after it pretty quick.
I think moving ahead on the governance has several benefits. One is the educational component of really getting the community into understanding now we have this body and they're tasked with providing X in the future, and so we get both the educational value of people in the community, and not just those people who are going to write it. They'll understand the value, but I think Steve brought up the economic development, or Marion brought up the economic development benefit, which is tremendous. I mean, that's what drives all of our communities, is the growth of our economies to get those sales tax to do it. So I'd be all for moving forward on governance.
Do we have the enabling legislation in place to do the governance side of it, even if it's not done?
Well, Marion probably knows as much about this as I do. We have, there is legislation in place that allows us to do something. We don't believe that it's enough for what we need to do. If we're looking at the district type model,
right,
it probably isn't. But I think there's something in place that allows, you know, a regional coalition or a regional authority to be established.
There is enabling legislation to do a regional taxation district, right?
That's correct.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's a significant
Indeed.
step. Okay, Marion?
If I remember correctly, I think it was near the end of the last RTD, and Bob Kemper got up and talked about his work with, I can't remember who introduced it, but the basics of an RTA framework to allow you to do that were approved almost unanimously through the House and Senate and everything, and so it's there. But my understanding is, Tom, you might have some more thoughts on that too, that there's a lot of details that aren't in there.
It was just a framework. It doesn't have any real details about what kind of authority it would be, how the taxing part of it would come about, but at least they've got to start.
But I think that's an argument for, as Pete pointed out, settling governance issues and then making sure